Suzanne Morphew's bicycle was found at the bottom of a Colorado ravine. Her helmet was discovered somewhere else. But more than 3 years later, investigators found something far more important. Suzanne's remains buried roughly 40 miles from her home. Inside her bone marrow were traces of 3 drugs used together to tranquilize wildlife. Prosecutors say that discovery transformed the case. Suzanne's husband, Barry Morphew, has pleaded not guilty and maintains that he did not kill her. Now, investigators must explain how a woman reported missing after an apparent bicycle ride came to be buried far from the bicycle, and how an unusual tranquilizer mixture entered her body. Suzanne Morphew was 49 years old and lived with her husband near Salida, Colorado. The couple had 2 adult daughters who were away from home during the Mother's Day weekend of 2020. On Sunday, May 10, Suzanne was reported missing after family members were unable to reach her. The first explanation presented publicly was that she might have disappeared while riding her mountain bike. A search began almost immediately. Suzanne's bicycle was soon located down a steep slope near County Road 225, not far from the family home. But investigators did not see the signs they expected from a serious cycling accident. The bicycle was not severely damaged. There was no clear trail showing that Suzanne had crashed and continued down the slope with it. Her personal items did not provide a simple explanation for where she had gone. Then her helmet was found in a different location. What initially appeared to be a bicycle disappearance was beginning to look like a constructed scene. Search teams moved through the mountainous area around the Morphew residence. Deputies, state investigators, federal agents, and volunteers examined roads, waterways, trails, and properties. Authorities eventually said that more than 70 investigators contributed to the case. They executed more than 135 search warrants. They interviewed over 400 people in several states. They investigated approximately 1,400 tips. Despite the scale of the operation, searchers found no confirmed trail showing that Suzanne had left the area voluntarily. There was no verified communication from her. There was no confirmed financial activity proving she had started a new life. There was also no body. Without Suzanne, investigators faced 2 separate questions. What had happened inside or near the Morphew home? And why had her bicycle been left in a ravine? Investigators reconstructed Suzanne's final known communications. They examined phone records, messages, photographs, device activity, and statements from people who had spoken with her. The timeline became important because Suzanne's daughters were away, and Barry said he had left early Sunday for work near Denver. Prosecutors would later contend that Suzanne stopped communicating normally during the afternoon of Saturday, May 9. The exact meaning of individual phone events remains disputed. A device that stops communicating does not, by itself, prove that a crime has occurred. A weak signal, a switched-off phone, or an unused application can all create gaps. But when investigators compared Suzanne's communication pattern with other activity around the residence, they began focusing on a limited period on Saturday afternoon. The critical question was no longer simply when she was reported missing. It was when she was last independently known to be safe. Investigators also examined the Morphew's marriage. This part of the case requires caution. Relationship conflict does not prove murder. An affair does not prove murder. A discussion of separation does not prove murder. But those circumstances can help investigators understand why a person disappeared and whether someone had a possible motive. Messages recovered during the investigation indicated serious tension between Suzanne and Barry. Suzanne had communicated with others about dissatisfaction in the marriage and the possibility of leaving. Investigators also discovered that Suzanne had been involved in a private relationship outside the marriage. The prosecution argues that the deterioration of the marriage provides context for what happened in May 2020. The defense disputes the prosecution's interpretation and maintains that marital difficulty cannot substitute for direct proof. The evidence had identified conflict. It had not yet established what caused Suzanne to disappear. Barry Morphew told investigators that he left the family home early on Sunday morning and traveled toward Broomfield, north of Denver, for work. Investigators examined his truck's data, phone records, hotel activity, and movements during that trip. The prosecution later highlighted several stops Barry made while traveling and while in the Broomfield area. Some of those stops involved disposing of items in public trash receptacles. Prosecutors regard those movements as suspicious. Barry provided work-related and ordinary explanations for his activity. No publicly established record shows that investigators recovered Suzanne's remains, clothing, or personal belongings from those trash locations. That distinction matters. A suspicious movement is not automatically incriminating evidence. But investigators were not evaluating one stop in isolation. They were comparing Barry's movements with Suzanne's loss of communication, the bicycle's location, and the condition of the home. The question became whether the trip was a normal work journey or part of a larger timeline. The bicycle remained one of the most visible pieces of evidence. If Suzanne had crashed, investigators expected physical signs consistent with a rider losing control. If she had been abducted during a ride, the location might have contained evidence of a confrontation. If she had left voluntarily, abandoning the bicycle in that location would have required an explanation. Investigators concluded that the scene did not resemble an ordinary accident. The prosecution alleges that the bicycle was deliberately placed down the slope to suggest Suzanne had vanished while riding. That allegation has not been decided by a jury. There is no publicly known video showing who put the bicycle there. There is no eyewitness publicly identified as having seen Suzanne riding away from the residence that morning. The bicycle created an immediate story, but the investigation could not confirm that Suzanne had been riding it. And without that confirmation, the object found in the ravine became less of an answer and more of a question. Suzanne's helmet was found separately along a nearby roadway. Its location further complicated the accident theory. Investigators had to determine whether the helmet had fallen during a ride, been discarded during an abduction, or been placed there afterward. Neither the helmet nor the bicycle revealed where Suzanne's body was. They did, however, create 2 points on a map. Those points could be compared with vehicle movements, device locations, and possible travel routes. This was not conventional surveillance footage showing a suspect entering or leaving a building. It was a reconstruction assembled from objects and digital traces. Each item carried uncertainty. Together, prosecutors believed they formed a pattern. But one major problem remained. Suzanne had still not been found. During the investigation, authorities learned that Barry had experience handling deer and possessed equipment used for wildlife tranquilization. The drug combination later central to the case is known as BAM. It contains buterphenol, azaparone, and medetomidine. These drugs are used together to immobilize animals. During the initial investigation, tranquilizer-related materials became part of the prosecution's theory. At that stage, however, authorities did not have Suzanne's remains and could not prove that any tranquilizer had entered her body. The presence of equipment or lawful access to a veterinary drug does not prove it was used against a person. The prosecution had a possible method. It did not yet have toxicological confirmation. That gap would remain for nearly 4 years. On the 5th of May, 2021, almost a year after Suzanne disappeared, Barry Morphew was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant. The case attracted national attention. Prosecutors prepared to try a murder case without having recovered Suzanne's body. Such cases can result in convictions, but they require the government to prove both that the missing person is dead and that the defendant caused the death. Barry pleaded not guilty. His attorneys challenged the evidence and argued that investigators had focused on him while failing to adequately pursue other possibilities. Then the case encountered a major legal failure. It was not a discovery about Suzanne. It was a problem with how the prosecution handled discovery. Before trial, the court found that prosecutors had repeatedly failed to meet obligations for turning evidence and expert information over to the defense. The judge imposed serious sanctions. Those sanctions prevented the prosecution from presenting some important expert testimony in the manner it had planned. In April 2022, prosecutors asked the court to dismiss the charges without prejudice. The request was granted. Without prejudice meant Barry had not been acquitted, and that charges could legally be filed again. But at that moment, he no longer faced a pending murder case. The collapse damaged public confidence in the prosecution. It also reinforced the need to distinguish between suspicion and proof. The government had arrested Barry. The government had not convicted him. Suzanne was still missing. And the investigators' most important unanswered question remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. Where was she? For Suzanne's family, the dismissal did not end the search. Law enforcement said the investigation remained active. The absence of charges did not change the fact that Suzanne had disappeared without confirmed contact, verified travel, or financial activity. Investigators continued following leads. The case also generated public speculation, much of which could not be verified. Online claims attempted to fill gaps left by sealed records and incomplete timelines. But speculation could not establish a cause of death. It could not identify a burial location, and it could not determine whether the tranquilizer theory was correct. That changed in September 2023, not because investigators were searching for Suzanne, but because they were working on another case. On the 22nd of September 2023, investigators searching near Moffat in Saguache County located human remains. The location was roughly 40 miles south of the area where Suzanne had lived. 5 days later, the El Paso County coroner formally identified the remains as Suzanne Morphew. After more than 3 years, her family finally knew where she was. But the discovery created an entirely new timeline problem. How had Suzanne reached that location? Was she buried there soon after she disappeared? Had her remains been moved? And what physical evidence had survived years of exposure and decomposition? Her remains showed no obvious skeletal trauma. There was no clear bone injury explaining how she died. Investigators therefore turned to toxicology. The results gave the case a new direction. The autopsy identified butyrophenol, azapirone, and medetomidine in Suzanne's bone marrow. Together, those substances are associated with the wildlife-tranquilizer mixture known as BAM. The coroner classified Suzanne's death as a homicide by undetermined means in the setting of intoxication by those drugs. The wording is important. The manner of death was homicide. The precise physical mechanism was not definitively established. Investigators did not find skeletal trauma. The toxicology did not create a video of what happened. It did not establish who administered the substances. It did not by itself prove where Suzanne died. But it connected the remains to a category of evidence investigators had examined years earlier. For the first time, the tranquilizer was no longer only a prosecution theory based on access and equipment. Components of that mixture had been detected in Suzanne's body. According to the 2025 indictment, Barry Morphew had previously possessed and used BAM in connection with deer. Prosecutors allege that, apart from wildlife authorities, he was the only known person in the surrounding area with a relevant prescription. That claim will be tested at trial. Access is not the same as administration. Investigators must still establish how the drugs entered Suzanne's system, when they entered it, and who was responsible. The defense can challenge the testing, the interpretation of the concentrations, the handling of the remains, and whether access was as exclusive as prosecutors claim. The unusual nature of the mixture nevertheless gives the evidence substantial importance. These were not ordinary household medicines. They were 3 components associated with immobilizing wildlife. The prosecution now had a potential link between Suzanne's body and equipment connected to her husband. But another question remained. Could investigators determine whether the place where she was found was the place where she had originally been left? According to the indictment, a forensic anthropologist examined the condition of Suzanne's remains and clothing. The expert offered the opinion that Suzanne may have decomposed in another environment before her remains were moved to the place where they were found. This is an investigative theory contained in a charging document. It is not a court finding. The defense may dispute both the expert's methods and conclusions. If Suzanne's remains were moved, the case would contain at least 2 relevant locations: the original location and the burial site near Moffat. Moving remains could also explain why years of searches near her home failed to locate her. But it would create another challenge for prosecutors. They would need to connect the accused not only to Suzanne's death, but also to the route and location involved in concealing her remains. The discovery had strengthened the government's case. It had also created new questions that digital evidence alone might not answer. On the 18th of June 2025, a Colorado grand jury returned a new indictment charging Barry Morphew with first-degree murder. He was taken into custody in Arizona 2 days later and returned to Colorado. This prosecution is being handled in the judicial district where Suzanne's remains were found, rather than by the office responsible for the original case. The new indictment relies on the cumulative investigation, including the autopsy and toxicology findings that did not exist during the first prosecution. Barry was later released on a $3 million bond. In January 2026, he entered a plea of not guilty. That plea means the prosecution carries the burden of proving the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. The indictment describes what the government believes happened. It is not evidence of guilt by itself. The second prosecution must also confront the legacy of the first. Jurors may hear about an investigation containing both unusual forensic evidence and serious previous mistakes. At trial, prosecutors must prove that Suzanne was intentionally killed and that Barry Morphew caused her death after deliberation. They are expected to present a circumstantial case built from several categories of evidence: the condition and placement of the bicycle, the separate helmet location, Suzanne's final communications, digital and vehicle records, evidence regarding the marriage, Barry's access to wildlife tranquilizers, the toxicology found in Suzanne's remains, and the location and condition of those remains. No single category necessarily proves the entire case. The prosecution's strength will depend on whether jurors believe the pieces reinforce one another, rather than merely appearing suspicious when placed side by side. The central prosecution question is straightforward. What innocent explanation accounts for all of these circumstances together? The defense does not have to prove what happened to Suzanne. It only has to create reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case. Barry's attorneys can challenge the absence of an eyewitness. They can emphasize that no publicly known recording captures a killing, burial, or staged bicycle scene. They can question whether the tranquilizer evidence proves who administered it. They can scrutinize the toxicology and the effects of decomposition. They can challenge interpretations of phone and vehicle data. They can point to investigative errors and the discovery failures that damaged the original prosecution. They may also argue that investigators formed a theory early and interpreted later evidence through that theory. The defense's central question will be equally direct. Does the evidence identify Barry beyond a reasonable doubt, or does it identify only a possible scenario? 6 years after Suzanne disappeared, several essential facts remain publicly unresolved. The precise location where she died has not been established in court. The exact time of her death has not been determined publicly. The method by which the 3 drugs entered her system has not been proven at trial. It remains disputed whether her remains were moved. There is no publicly established eyewitness to her death, and no jury has decided whether the prosecution's reconstruction is correct. The discovery of Suzanne's remains answered the family's most painful location question. It did not answer every question about the final hours of her life. Those answers must now be tested through evidence, witnesses, and cross-examination, not through online speculation. Suzanne Morphew should not be remembered only as a name attached to a bicycle, a court file, or a toxicology report. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a woman whose disappearance left her family without answers for more than 3 years. Her remains eventually provided evidence that investigators could not obtain while she was missing. But evidence gains legal meaning only when it survives examination in court. Barry Morphew has pleaded not guilty and is presumed innocent unless proven guilty. When the trial begins, jurors will be asked to decide whether the bicycle, the digital timeline, the tranquilizer evidence, and the burial location form one coherent account of Suzanne's death. Until that evidence is heard and tested, the most important question remains open. Can prosecutors prove not only what happened to Suzanne Morphew, but who was responsible? If you want to follow Suzanne Morphew's case as the evidence is presented and tested in court, Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. In the comments, tell us, which part of the evidence do you believe will be most important at trial? The bicycle scene, the digital timeline, the tranquilizer findings, or the location of Suzanne's remains? Please keep the discussion respectful. Barry Morphew has pleaded not guilty and remains presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Share this documentary with someone who follows unresolved criminal cases and believes that facts, not speculation, should guide the search for justice. Thank you for watching, and may Suzanne Morphew's family ultimately receive the complete truth and lasting peace they deserve.